The rain drifted across the Arizona desert like a thin gray curtain, soft enough to blur the outlines of Cole Brennan's small rental house, but steady enough to keep the sky heavy and low. The storm had been building since dawn, gathering on the far edge of the horizon before finally settling over the valley like something inevitable, something that had been waiting. Inside, the dim light from a single kitchen bulb reflected off the metal sink and the worn wooden table where Cole sat, one hand cupped around a mug of black coffee gone cold hours ago. The house was quiet except for the rain tapping the windows and the slow measured breaths of Stryker, his retired canine partner, resting on the floor beside him. Stryker's tan and black fur blended into the shadows near Cole's boots, but his amber eyes never left his handler. Even in retirement, the dog remained vigilant, attuned to every shift in Cole's posture, every break in his breathing, every tension that rippled through the silence between them. Cole's mornings were usually predictable. Coffee, a long walk with Stryker along the desert trails where the heat hadn't yet settled into the sand. Maybe a trip to the hardware store if he needed something to keep his hands busy, something to anchor him to the present instead of letting him drift back to places he'd worked hard to leave behind. Routine wasn't comfort, but it was something solid to stand on. Today, though, something felt different. There was a thin knot in his chest, the kind of pressure that often preceded a memory he didn't want to revisit. The kind that made his hands tighten around the coffee mug until his knuckles went white. A sharp knock at the door cut through the quiet like a blade. Stryker rose instantly, muscles tensing, tail stiff and low. His entire body shifted into the alert posture Cole had seen 1,000 times overseas, the one that meant threat assessment, the one that meant something was wrong. Cole's shoulders tightened. At this hour and weather like this, no one knocked without a reason. He stood slowly, steadying himself against the familiar weight that sometimes came with sudden noise, the pressure behind his ribs that felt like and heat, and the distant thrum of helicopter blades. His hand brushed Stryker's head, a silent message, the same one they'd exchanged countless times in combat zones halfway across the world. Easy. With me. Cole opened the door to find a postal carrier bracing herself against the rain. She held a clipboard sealed under a plastic cover and a single large envelope tucked against her chest, protected from the downpour. "Mr. Cole Brennan." "That's me. I need a signature. Certified delivery." He signed without thinking, the motion automatic like muscle memory from a simpler life before everything got complicated. The carrier hurried back to her truck, boots splashing through shallow puddles that had formed in the cracked driveway. Cole closed the door and stared at the envelope. It was heavy, formal. The kind of weight that carried obligation rather than news, the kind that changed things whether you wanted them to or not. Stryker returned to his place by the table, watching him with steady, unblinking eyes that seemed to understand more than any dog should. Cole tore open the seal slowly, deliberately, as if delaying the inevitable might somehow make it less real. A smaller envelope slid out, embossed with the name Harmon and Fields Law Office, Evergreen Ridge, Colorado. His breath hitched. He hadn't thought of Colorado in years. Hadn't thought of Evergreen Ridge or anyone in it since he'd left home at 18 with nothing but a duffel bag and a burning need to escape everything his father represented. He unfolded the letter carefully, the paper crisp and expensive beneath his calloused fingers. "Dear Mr. Brennan, we regret to inform you of the passing of Miss June Brennan." The words blurred for a moment before sharpening again, cutting through the fog in his mind like broken glass. His grandmother, the woman who had lived tucked away in the mountains of Colorado, too far from the rest of the world for anyone to check on her, too stubborn to ask for help even when she needed it most. The one person in his family who had tried quietly and imperfectly to reach out when he was younger. The one who had sent him letters he never answered, cards on birthdays. He tried to forget, small reminders that someone out there still thought about him even after everyone else had given up. And he had never written back. Not once. Cole exhaled slowly, the breath shaky and uneven. June Brennan was gone. The last thread connecting him to anything that resembled family had finally snapped. The letter continued. "You have been named her sole heir. Please contact our office regarding the transfer of her property and estate." Cole leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking under his weight. Property. Estate. His grandmother had lived her whole life without 2 spare dollars to rub together. Whatever she left behind couldn't be worth much. Maybe a small cabin, a patch of land too rocky to farm, too remote to develop. The kind of place people forgot about until someone died and left it to someone else who didn't want it. But the fact that she had left anything to him at all felt heavier than the storm outside. A dull ache started behind his ribs, the kind that came with memories he'd worked hard to bury. Nights on deployment when nothing but the sound of gunfire kept him awake. The patrol that went wrong. The friend he couldn't save. His father's voice cold and sharp, cutting through every attempt Cole made to explain, to apologize, to make things right. All of it pressed forward, uninvited, crowding the small kitchen until there wasn't enough air left to breathe. Stryker stepped closer and rested his broad head on Cole's knee. The weight was immediate, grounding, real. Cole's hand moved automatically to the dog's fur, fingers tangling in the thick coat, feeling the warmth and solidity of something that wouldn't abandon him, wouldn't judge him, wouldn't ask for explanations he couldn't give. Stryker had saved him more times than he could count. Sometimes from danger, sometimes from himself. "I'm okay," Cole murmured, though his voice was thin and unconvincing. Stryker didn't move. He simply stayed there, breathing slow and warm against Cole's leg, refusing to let him drift too far into the dark spaces of his mind where the past lived like a shadow he couldn't shake. Outside, thunder rumbled across the desert, low and distant, a warning of something coming. Cole reread the letter. Evergreen Ridge, his grandmother. An inheritance he never asked for. A past he'd tried hard not to look back at, tried to bury under years of distance and deployment and deliberate forgetting. For the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the numbness. An invitation. Or maybe a responsibility. A pull toward a place he'd abandoned long ago, towards something unfinished. He folded the letter carefully and set it on the table beside the cold coffee. The storm outside showed no sign of letting up, and neither did the tension tightening across his chest like a vice. But one thing was certain. He couldn't ignore this. Not anymore. Not when the last person who had ever cared about him had left him something, even if it was just a piece of land and a house full of ghosts. Stryker lifted his head, ears perked forward as if sensing the decision forming in Cole's mind, the shift in his breathing that meant movement and action, the end of waiting. "Yeah," Cole whispered into the silence. "Looks like we're going to Colorado, buddy." Stryker let out a soft huff of breath, almost like agreement, as if he'd known all along that this moment was coming and had simply been waiting for Cole to catch up. 2 days later, Cole's old Tacoma rolled northbound on Highway 191, the desert giving way to long stretches of open land and distant ridge lines that rose like ancient sentinels against the sky. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, alert but calm, his gaze fixed on the rolling horizon ahead. His posture was perfect, disciplined, the same way it had been on every mission they'd run together. Even now, years removed from active duty, the dog carried himself with the quiet dignity of a soldier who understood his purpose. The farther they drove, the more the air changed. Cooler, sharper, carrying the faint scent of pine even before the trees appeared, even before the mountains began to rise in the distance, like something out of a memory Cole didn't know he still had. He kept both hands on the wheel, his eyes scanning the empty road, the way he used to watch perimeters overseas. It wasn't habit anymore. It was instinct wired so deep into his nervous system that he couldn't turn it off even when he wanted to. The letter sat folded on the dashboard, held in place by a pair of scratched sunglasses he'd owned since his second deployment. He had read it enough times to memorize every line, every word, every implication hidden between the formalities. June Brennan. Gone. And he was the only one left to handle her affairs, the only one she'd trusted enough to leave anything to, despite the years of silence, despite the letters he'd never answered. The highway narrowed as the land climbed, drawing them toward the Rockies like a slow, inevitable pull. Snow-dusted peaks loomed in the distance, their jagged edges scraping the clouds, cutting the sky into pieces. Stryker shifted in his seat, ears twitching as the truck bounced over a patch of broken asphalt. "You feel it too," Cole murmured, though he wasn't sure what it was he was feeling. Maybe it was the sense of returning to a past he'd never fully walked away from, or the uneasy knot tightening with every mile that brought him closer to a place he'd sworn never to return to. Maybe it was his grandmother's voice in the back of his mind, faint but persistent, urging him home, even though she was gone, even though there was no home left to return to. He didn't know. He only knew the road felt heavier than it should. Late afternoon brought them to a narrow valley town called Reston Junction, a cluster of aging storefronts and rusted metal roofs that looked like they belonged in another decade entirely. Cole pulled into the single gas station, its faded signs swaying in the wind with a tired creak that echoed across the empty lot. Stryker stood in the truck bed, while Cole pumped gas, his nose lifted toward the wind, testing the air for threats, the way he always did in unfamiliar territory. A few locals lingered near the convenience store entrance, bundled against the cold that had settled over the valley like a blanket. Their conversations quieted the moment they saw him, their eyes tracking his movements with the kind of cautious curiosity reserved for strangers in small towns. At first, Cole assumed they were curious about Stryker. A retired military K-9 always drew attention, especially one as disciplined and imposing as this one. But their eyes didn't leave his face. A thin man in a flannel jacket stepped closer, studying him with a cautious stare that felt too deliberate, too knowing. "You passing through?" the man asked, his voice rough and wary. "Heading to Evergreen Ridge," Cole replied, replacing the gas nozzle with a metallic click. The man's expression tightened. Another older guy near the doorway muttered something under his breath, too quiet for Cole to catch, but the word Brennan floated through the cold air like smoke. A woman inside the store peeked through the window, her brow knitted with concern, or maybe warning. Cole couldn't tell which. The man in the flannel jacket cleared his throat, glancing toward the cloudy ridge line in the distance, where the road disappeared into the mountains. "Brennans don't come back to these parts," he said quietly, almost like a confession. "Not since the incident." Before Cole could ask what incident, the man stepped back, suddenly unwilling to continue, unwilling to meet his eyes. He motioned vaguely toward the ridge, his voice dropping even lower. "Road gets rough from here on out. Watch for early snow." Cole didn't press further. Questions could wait. Whatever history his grandmother had left behind in this place, it was clear people remembered it, carried it like a wound that had never fully healed. He paid inside, where the cashier barely met his eyes, her hands trembling slightly as she made change. When he returned to the truck, Stryker stood rigid in the bed, scanning the parking lot with the focused intensity of a soldier on patrol. "Let's go," Cole said softly, climbing into the driver's seat. They left the town behind, following a winding state road that climbed higher into the mountains with every turn. Paved asphalt gave way to gravel. Gravel gave way to packed dirt that crunched beneath the tires like broken bones. Dense pines rose on both sides, their branches heavy with the season's first snow, pressing in close enough to scrape the truck's mirrors. The air grew colder with every mile, sharper, thinner, carrying the kind of silence that only existed in places where people rarely went. Stryker leaned forward in his seat, nose testing the air through the cracked window. His posture shifted from relaxed to razor alert, the same transformation Cole had seen countless times before danger revealed itself. "You smell something?" Cole asked, easing off the gas. Stryker's quiet rumble was answer enough. The road curved sharply along a ridge, and Cole slowed even more, his eyes scanning the terrain with practiced precision. To his right, the land fell away into a deep shadowed ravine, dotted with fallen logs and glistening rock. Above them, clouds gathered thick and heavy, threatening snow. Minutes later, Cole spotted an old wooden sign half swallowed by vines and moss. "Evergreen Ridge. 14 miles. The deeper they went, the more isolated everything felt. Half-collapsed barns leaned toward the earth like tired men. Faded trail markers pointed into dark forests where light didn't reach. An abandoned mining bridge crossed a stream swollen with meltwater, its wooden boards groaning beneath the truck's weight as they rolled across. Cole kept one hand near Stryker's harness, the way he always did when danger lingered close but unseen, when the silence felt too complete, too deliberate. Dusk began settling over the mountains, tinting the world in muted blue and shadow. The light faded faster here than it did in the desert, swallowed by the peaks and the trees, until there was nothing left but the pale glow of headlights cutting through the gathering dark. A solitary crow perched on a stump, watching silently as they passed, its black eyes following the truck until it disappeared around the next bend. A chill crept into the cab, not from the temperature, but from the sudden stillness of the forest around them, from the way the trees seemed to lean in closer, listening. Stryker's ears snapped forward, body going rigid. Then Cole saw it too. A dark pickup parked on the side of the dirt road, its engine idling, exhaust curling into the cold air like breath. The driver's silhouette was barely visible through the tinted glass, unmoving, watching. The truck didn't move as Cole passed, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge him at all. But Stryker issued a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the seat, through the floorboards, through Cole's chest like a warning he couldn't ignore. "Easy," Cole whispered, though his own nerves tightened like wire. The black pickup appeared again 5 minutes later, this time coming from a side trail and merging behind them on the narrow road. Cole checked the mirror. The truck kept its distance, at first maintaining a careful gap that felt deliberate, calculated. Then slowly it closed the distance. Old training kicked in without thought. Cole assessed escape routes, terrain features, blind curves. His grip on the wheel tightened, knuckles going white. Finally, without warning, the pickup pulled off onto another narrow trail and vanished between the trees, swallowed by the forest as quickly as it had appeared. Cole exhaled slowly, forcing his breathing to steady, forcing the adrenaline to drain from his system before it turned into something worse. He wasn't sure if the truck had been following him or if he simply didn't want to assume the worst, didn't want to carry the paranoia from overseas into this place where it didn't belong. But Stryker kept staring back at the empty trail long after the truck was gone, his body still tense, still ready. By the time they reached the fork leading to Evergreen Ridge, night had begun to swallow the sky completely. The stars were different here than they were in Arizona, brighter and colder scattered across the darkness like broken glass. Cole drove on guided by the faint glow of headlights against the snow-covered trees and the narrow road that wound higher into the mountains with every turn. Whatever waited for them in that forgotten mountain town, he could feel it settling in the air around them. Quiet, heavy, watching. Stryker pressed close to the door, his breath fogging the glass as he scanned the trees for movement, for threats, for answers to questions Cole hadn't even thought to ask yet. "Stay sharp, buddy," Cole whispered into the darkness. "We're not in Arizona anymore." Evergreen Ridge appeared slowly out of the trees as the dirt road straightened, revealing itself piece by piece like something that had been hiding. A handful of warm lights twinkled from distant windows, but most of the town looked dark. The kind of place where everyone turned in early because there wasn't much reason to stay awake, wasn't much left to do once the sun went down. Snow clung to roofs and piled along the roadside in uneven drifts. A wooden sign swung in the breeze, its paint peeling, but still legible enough to say, "Welcome to Evergreen Ridge, population 612. Cole drove through the center without stopping, his eyes taking in the details with the automatic precision of someone trained to observe, to assess, to remember. A diner with a flickering neon open sign stood at one end of the street, its windows fogged with condensation. Across from it sat a courthouse that looked like it had been built in the 1950s and never updated since its stone facade crumbling at the edges. The streets were nearly empty. Only an elderly man sweeping snow off his porch paused to stare as the Tacoma passed his broom, going still in his hands, his eyes following the truck with something that looked like recognition. The road leading to June Brennan's property wound up the eastern ridge, growing steeper, with every turn the trees pressing closer on both sides until their branches nearly brushed the truck's mirrors. Tall pines surrounded them, their dark silhouettes cutting jagged patterns against the night sky. Cole glanced at the GPS again, though it hadn't been helpful since losing signal 20 minutes ago. He relied mostly on the directions mailed with the letter handwritten notes that felt like they'd been copied from memory rather than any map. Eventually, the last sign of the town disappeared behind them, swallowed by distance and darkness. The headlights cut through fog and falling snow, illuminating a narrow path carved along the mountainside, winding higher and higher, until the air felt thin enough to taste. Stryker sniffed the air, ears flicking back and forth, his body perfectly still, except for the subtle movements of his head as he tracked scents Cole couldn't perceive. He sat in that heightened, alert posture, the one that meant something important was close, something that required attention. A final bend brought them to a clearing, and there it was. The cabin stood beneath a towering granite cliff, its roof blanketed in snow, its stone chimney rising like a lonely sentinel against the sky. The structure was small but solid, built from dark wood that had weathered decades of mountain winters. The porch sagged slightly on one side but held together, and a single metal wind chime hung from a beam turning silently in the cold breeze. Tall pines crowded the edges of the clearing, forming a natural wall that made the place feel isolated, protected, hidden from the world in a way that felt both peaceful and unsettling. Cole cut the engine. For a moment, the world fell unbelievably quiet. Only the soft patter of snow and Stryker's steady breathing filled the air. Nothing else, no wind, no animals, no signs of life except the two of them sitting in the darkness. "Well," Cole murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't kidding about remote. He stepped out into the cold, pulling his jacket tighter against the wind that cut through the clearing like a knife. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since they'd left the valley, and the air smelled like pine and snow and something older, something that felt like time itself. Stryker jumped down beside him, landing silently despite the snow, his paws sinking into the fresh powder. The dog moved ahead immediately, conducting a careful arc around the porch, nose low to the ground, tail straight and still. He checked corners, the path to the outhouse barely visible in the darkness, the base of the cliff where shadows pooled like ink. Then he returned to Cole's side, sitting without being told, his body language, neutral but ready. A full sweep. Quick. Thorough. Practiced. "No threats?" Cole asked quietly. Stryker's amber eyes met his, calm and steady, not alarmed but not relaxed either. Neutral readiness, the mountain kind. Cole approached the cabin door slowly, his boots crunching through the snow with each step. A tarnished brass key waited under a smooth river stone beside the doorframe, exactly where the letter had said it would be, exactly where his grandmother had left it for him, even though she must have known she'd never see him use it. The lock turned with a slow, hollow click that echoed across the clearing. He pushed the door open carefully, half expecting it to creak, but it moved smoothly on well-oiled hinges. Cold air breathed out from the darkness inside, carrying with it a faint mixture of pine old books, dust, and something he couldn't quite name. Something that felt like time suspended, like a life paused mid-breath and never resumed. He reached for the flashlight on his belt and stepped inside. Stryker padded in beside him, silent and steady, his presence a constant reassurance in the unfamiliar darkness. The interior was dim, swallowed by shadows that seemed to press against the walls. But as the beam swept across the room, details emerged slowly, piece by piece. A coat hung neatly on a wooden peg by the door, its fabric still holding the shape of the person who had worn it last. A cup sat beside the sink, clean but waiting. A knitted blanket was folded across the back of a rocking chair that faced the cold fireplace. Dust lay thick on every surface coating the table, the shelves, the windowsills, with a fine gray layer that spoke of months, maybe years without disturbance. Yet nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing looked ransacked or abandoned in haste. It looked like his grandmother had stepped out for a few minutes and simply never returned, like she'd intended to come back, but had run out of time. Cole felt a shift in his chest, an ache he didn't want to acknowledge, didn't know how to process. He had barely known June Brennan. A handful of childhood memories blurred by time and distance. Summer visits when he was young, before his father had forbidden them. Her letters that arrived every year on his birthday, written in careful cursive he'd never had the courage to answer. But the small reminders of her presence stirred something complicated inside him. Guilt, maybe. Regret. A sense of loss he hadn't expected to feel for someone who had always existed more as an idea than a person. Stryker moved ahead, nose to the floorboards, his posture tightening with every step he took deeper into the cabin. "What is it?" Cole asked softly, watching the dog's movements with the attention born from years of trusting his partner's instincts more than his own. The dog didn't respond, too focused, his tail, rigid ears angled forward in concentration. He traced a path toward the table, circled it twice with deliberate precision, then paused near the old fireplace. He let out a faint whine, the kind he used when identifying something unfamiliar, but not dangerous, something that required investigation. Cole crouched beside him, scanning the room again, with the flashlight looking for whatever had caught Stryker's attention. The place was still silent, but something about the silence felt unnatural now. Too complete. Too heavy. Like it had been held there for years without escaping, trapped inside these walls, like a secret no one was meant to find. He stood slowly and walked through the main room, feeling Stryker's shadow at his heels, the dog's breathing steady and controlled. A narrow hallway led to a small kitchen area, then a bedroom at the back with a single bed covered in a faded quilt. A wooden ladder led to a loft above, barely visible in the darkness. Everything inside was well-worn yet tidy, arranged with the kind of care that spoke of a simple and orderly life, a life lived quietly and alone. But beneath the order was something else. A hush that made Cole's skin prickle, a weight in the air that pressed against his chest like something waiting. His PTSD stirred unexpectedly, not violently, just a low pressure behind his ribs, the kind he'd felt on long night patrols overseas, when the desert air held its breath right before something moved in the darkness, right before everything went wrong. He focused on Stryker's presence, grounding himself the way therapists had taught him, anchoring his mind to the present, instead of letting it spiral back to sand and heat and the faces of people he couldn't save. Stryker nudged his hand with a soft, deliberate touch. "I'm good," Cole whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. He walked to the window beside the kitchen table, looking out over the valley below. A sea of dark pines stretched endlessly beneath a clouded sky, their tops barely visible in the moonlight. Somewhere out there was the town. Somewhere out there were people who remembered his grandmother, who whispered her name like a curse. If someone stood in those woods watching, he wouldn't be able to see them through the snow and darkness. He didn't like that thought, neither did Stryker. The dog remained close, head high, staring out into the dusk as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows, something that had been waiting for them to arrive. Cole took a slow breath, forcing the tension from his shoulders. "This is home for now," he said quietly, maybe speaking more to himself than to Stryker. "We'll sort it out. Whatever she left, whatever happened here, we'll figure it out." Stryker's ear twitched, acknowledging the words without breaking his vigilant watch. Cole walked back to the fireplace and brushed a layer of dust from the mantel with his gloved hand. A framed photograph leaned against the stone, its glass clouded with age. A younger June Brennan standing in front of this same cabin, holding a basket of herbs, smiling at the camera, with a warmth that made Cole's chest tighten. Beside her stood a man Logan didn't recognize, tall and thin, with a kind smile and eyes that seemed to understand something the camera couldn't capture. He reached out to pick up the photo, but before his fingers touched the frame, Stryker stiffened. The dog's entire body went still, ears locked forward, eyes fixed on the far corner of the room near the old wooden dresser that stood against the bedroom wall. Cole followed his gaze slowly, the flashlight beam sweeping across the floor, the walls searching for whatever had caught the dog's attention. There beside the dresser, along the bedroom wall, a faint seam in the wood caught the light, a seam that didn't belong, a line too straight, too deliberate to be a natural crack in the aging timber. A seam he hadn't noticed a moment ago. A quiet pulse of unease rippled through him, the same instinct that had kept him alive in places where hesitation meant death. He didn't investigate. Not yet. Not tonight. Not when exhaustion pulled at his bones and the darkness outside felt too complete, too watchful. Instead, he stepped back, turned on his heel, and said softly, "Let's set camp, Stryker. We'll check everything in the morning." But even as he said it, he knew. The house held something, and it had been waiting a long time for someone to find it. Night settled over the ridge like a heavy blanket pressing against the cabin walls with a weight that felt almost physical. The wind outside carried the low rustling of pine branches that scraped softly along the weathered boards, a sound that might have been soothing in another place, another time, but here felt like something trying to get in. Cole built a small fire in the stone fireplace, coaxing flames from kindling, and split logs he'd found stacked neatly beside the hearth. The orange glow pushed back the shadows that had crept into every corner of the room, but it couldn't touch the deeper darkness that seemed to live inside these walls. Stryker lay near the hearth, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes remained open, always open, tracking every sound, every shift in the air. His ears twitched at each pop of the burning wood, each sigh of the wind against the windows. He was listening, evaluating, waiting. Cole unrolled his sleeping bag on the old couch and sat down slowly, feeling the stiffness in his shoulders from 2 days of driving, from the tension that had been building since he'd opened that letter back in Arizona. The warmth of the fire eased some of the physical strain, but the knot of unease remained settled deep in his chest like something he couldn't cough up, couldn't swallow down. The faint seam he'd spotted near the dresser lingered in the back of his mind like an unfinished sentence, like a question he wasn't ready to ask but couldn't stop thinking about. He rubbed his face with both hands, trying to settle his thoughts, trying to quiet the part of his brain that kept running through scenarios, threats, possibilities. "We'll check it in the morning," he muttered to himself, though he knew sleep wouldn't come easy tonight. Stryker didn't move, but his ears pricked at the sound of Cole's voice acknowledging without needing to respond. The fire crackled quietly, sending shadows dancing across the wooden beams overhead. Cole leaned back against the couch, letting the soft warmth wash over him, trying to focus on the ordinary things. The smell of burning wood, the familiar creak of old floorboards, the comforting presence of Stryker nearby. But memories crawled in around the edges anyway, the way they always did when he let his guard down, when exhaustion made the walls between past and present too thin to hold. Nights in the desert when silence meant danger. Moments before an ambush, when the world seemed to hold its breath and wait for violence to break the stillness. The feeling of being responsible for lives that depended on decisions he made in seconds. Decisions that couldn't be taken back, couldn't be fixed when they went wrong. He closed his eyes just for a moment, trying to push it all away. A sudden sound shattered the quiet. Sharp scratching. Quick. Urgent. Deliberate. Cole bolted upright, adrenaline flooding his system before conscious thought could catch up. Stryker was already on his feet, body rigid, a deep growl vibrating in his chest that filled the small cabin with barely contained threat. The dog moved across the room in seconds, stopping at the old chest of drawers pressed against the far wall, the same place where Cole had seen that faint seam in the wood. The scratching came again, but this time it was clear. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the cabin, inside the wall. Logan grabbed his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the dresser, his heart pounding hard enough to feel in his throat. Stryker pawed at the floor, then at the wood itself, his nose pressed tight against the seam Cole had noticed earlier, the line that was too straight, too clean to be accidental. "You've got something," Cole whispered, his voice barely audible over the blood rushing in his ears. He approached slowly, the way he used to approach suspicious objects overseas, the way he'd been trained to move when everything could be a trap, when hesitation and recklessness were equally dangerous. Measured steps, steady breath, every sense alert. He placed a hand on Stryker's back, feeling the coiled tension in the dog's muscles, the readiness to act, to protect, to fight if necessary. The dog's body was tight as a spring, waiting for permission, waiting for direction. Cole crouched beside him and ran his fingertips along the seam, feeling the edges of the wood, searching for anything that might explain what he was seeing. The wood was old, weathered by decades of mountain winters, but it wasn't warped. The seam was too precise, too intentional. A faint draft seeped through the edges, cold air from somewhere deeper, somewhere hidden. Hidden panel, he murmured more to himself than to Stryker. He pushed gently against the wood. Nothing budged. Stryker scratched again, two sharp, insistent strokes against the floor, then looked up at Cole with amber eyes that seemed to say exactly what he was thinking. Here. Right here. Cole braced his legs and gripped the edge of the dresser, sliding the heavy piece of furniture aside with slow, deliberate effort. Dust rose in a soft cloud drifting through the beam of his flashlight like ash coating his throat with the taste of neglect and time. Once the dresser cleared the space completely, he knelt again and pressed along the panel with both hands, searching for the mechanism, the trigger, whatever his grandmother had used to keep this hidden for so long. His fingers found a loose edge near the bottom, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The wood clicked soft and subtle, a sound that might have been nothing if the room hadn't been so silent. The panel shifted inward with a faint groan of protest. A small dark cavity revealed itself behind the wall, no larger than a shoebox, but deep enough to hold something that had been waiting in darkness for longer than Cole had been alive. The air inside smelled of oiled cloth, an age of secrets kept and stories never told. Cole reached in carefully, his fingertips brushing cold metal buried beneath layers of fabric. He pulled out a rusted lockbox wrapped in what looked like old oilcloth, the kind used to protect things from moisture and time. It was heavier than it looked, solid and real in his hands. Stryker backed up slightly, watching with steady, unblinking attention, his tail. Still, his posture cautious but not alarmed. Cole set the box on the table near the fire where the light was better. The flames flickered over its dented surface, highlighting scratches and rust spots that spoke of years hidden away, years of being deliberately forgotten. He took a moment before opening it, steadying his breath, grounding himself in the present, instead of letting his mind spiral into questions he couldn't answer yet. "Let's see what you've been hiding, June," he whispered into the quiet. He unfastened the latch, corroded but still functional, and lifted the lid slowly. The hinges creaked in protest, breaking the silence like a confession. Inside lay a collection of objects, carefully arranged, preserved, as if someone had known they would matter someday, as if they had been saved for exactly this moment. Black and white photographs, their edges curled with age. A stack of newspaper clippings held together with a rusted paperclip. Several handwritten notes tied with twine that had gone brittle and brown. And beneath it all, bundles of old bills, thick and faded, the kind that hadn't been printed in decades. Cole lifted the top newspaper clipping with careful fingers. The headline struck him like a physical blow, the words cutting through the fog of exhaustion and confusion with brutal clarity. "Relief funds missing after mudslide disaster. Local woman vanishes." His grandmother's name appeared in the second paragraph, printed in black ink that had faded to gray, but still carried the weight of accusation. June Brennan, committee accountant, accused of mishandling funds in the wake of the 1964 disaster. Rumors of embezzlement, investigation pending. Subject disappeared before questioning. Logan stared at the words, his jaw tightening until his teeth ached. "That's why they looked at me in town," he muttered under his breath, the pieces starting to fall into place with sickening clarity. Stryker pressed his head against Cole's leg, sensing the shift in his emotions, the anger beginning to simmer beneath the surface, the frustration of discovering that the woman who had tried to reach out to him, who had left him this place, had been branded a thief by people who should have known better. Cole pulled out the second clipping, his hands steadier, now focused. Another headline, another accusation, another hint that June Brennan had fled town before she could be questioned, before justice could be served, before the truth could surface. No wonder the name carried weight in this town. No wonder people whispered when they saw him. He reached for the handwritten notes, untying the brittle twine with gentle fingers. The ink had faded, but his grandmother's handwriting was strong and decisive. Each letter formed with the kind of care that came from deliberate thought, from words that mattered too much to be careless. October 30th, 1964. "They're blaming me. I knew they would. Benjamin Caldwell came to the house yesterday. He said the missing funds were my responsibility. He said if I spoke a word of the truth, I'd lose everything. But I cannot stay silent. I will hide what I know. One day someone will need it." Cole read the words twice before setting the page down, exhaling slowly as the weight of what she'd carried settled onto his shoulders like a physical burden. The tension in his chest deepened, spreading through his ribs, making it harder to breathe. His grandmother hadn't just been caught in some misunderstanding. She had been targeted, pressured, threatened, and she had chosen to protect evidence rather than protect herself. Stryker stepped closer, resting his chin on Cole's thigh, offering the kind of steady warmth that words couldn't provide, the kind of presence that anchored him when everything else felt like it was slipping away. Cole picked up another entry dated 2 weeks later. November 12, 1964. Benjamin Caldwell offered me money. He said if I disappeared quietly, the town would forget. I refused. He called me foolish. But I know what they did. I know whose hands stole from the victims. If the truth dies with me, then the town dies with it. A cold knot formed in Cole's stomach, tightening with each word he read. The pieces were beginning to form a picture he didn't want to see, but couldn't look away from. He sifted through the remaining pages, finding more journal entries interspersed with letters his grandmother had written, but never sent. One was addressed to his father. Envelope yellowed and sealed, never opened. His hands trembled just slightly when he held that one feeling, the weight of words he might never read, conversations that should have happened, but didn't, explanations that came too late to matter. He didn't open it, not yet. Not until he understood the full story, not until he knew what his grandmother had been trying to protect. Stryker let out a quiet huff, turning toward the window, his body stiffening again in that alert posture that meant something outside had changed. Something had moved. Cole followed his gaze, but the darkness beyond the glass revealed nothing. Just snowflakes drifting lazily through the beam of light from the cabin windows. Just the vague shapes of pine trees swaying in the wind. "It's okay," Cole whispered, though he wasn't certain himself. He returned to the box and lifted a stack of old photographs, black and white images that looked like they'd been taken with a cheap camera decades ago. Flooded streets, destroyed homes, volunteers working with shovels and buckets, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief. And there, near what looked like a relief station, 3 figures standing together. June Brennan, younger but unmistakable, standing strong and straight with her eyes bright even in grayscale. Beside her, a man Cole didn't recognize, wearing a suit that looked too formal for the muddy devastation around them. Benjamin Caldwell. Even in a photograph taken 60 years ago, the man's posture spoke of power, of control, of someone used to being obeyed. His foot was angled slightly away from the camera, like someone hiding discomfort, like someone who didn't want to be there but couldn't afford not to be. Cole set the photos aside carefully, his mind working through the implications, the connections forming, like a map he was only beginning to see. This wasn't just about money, he said quietly to the empty room. This was about power. He leaned back in the chair, rubbing the back of his neck, where tension had gathered like a fist. A familiar heaviness crept through his chest, the kind that sometimes accompanied old memories, the kind that made his hands shake and his breathing shallow. It was the same sensation that flickered through him when the past pressed in too hard, when the weight of responsibility and failure and loss became too much to carry alone. The sound of explosions, the sight of a teammate going down, the feeling of being in charge when everything went wrong, and knowing that orders he gave, decisions he made, had cost someone their life. Stryker nudged him again, harder, this time more insistent. Cole took a deep breath, letting it out slowly through his teeth, counting to 4, holding, releasing. The technique his therapist had taught him, the one that sometimes worked when his mind threatened to spiral. "Thanks, partner," he whispered, his voice rough. He returned to the table and opened the final letter in the stack, recognizing immediately that the handwriting was shakier than the earlier pages written years later, when his grandmother's hands had begun to fail, when time had taken its toll. "If you are reading this, it means the truth survived longer than I expected. I pray you are stronger than I was. I pray you are not afraid. They wanted the money. They took it from the people who needed it most. And when I tried to stop them, they made sure I was alone." Cole swallowed hard, his throat tight. His grandmother hadn't left town to save herself. She had left to save the evidence, to protect the truth, even when it cost her everything, even when it meant living the rest of her life branded as a criminal, forgotten by everyone except the few who knew better. He stood slowly and walked to the window, looking out at the forest that stretched endlessly into darkness. Somewhere out there, someone had broken into this cabin last night. Someone who still feared what June Brennan had left behind, who knew that secrets buried for 60 years might still have the power to destroy. "We can't run from this," Cole said quietly, more to himself than to Stryker. The dog pressed against his leg in silent agreement, solid and unwavering. Cole turned back to the table, his decision made. He grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door and tucked the journal pages into the inner pocket, folding them carefully so they wouldn't crease, so they wouldn't be damaged. He scanned the room once more, taking in the details he'd missed, before recognizing now the weight of history within these walls, the burden his grandmother had carried alone for so long. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, sending a cascade of snow sliding off the roof with a sound like distant thunder. As Cole and Stryker stepped toward the door to secure it for the night, the dog paused, ears angled toward the woods beyond the clearing. Cole stopped listening. Nothing moved. No sound except the wind and the settling snow. But Stryker's posture said otherwise. Something was out there. Something watching. Cole locked the door behind them and moved back to the fireplace, adding another log to keep the flames going through the night. What she did, she didn't do for herself, he said softly, thinking of June, imagining her alone in this cabin, holding on to truth while the world outside called her a liar. And now we finish what she started. Stryker barked once, low and steady, a sound of acknowledgement and readiness. The mountain wasn't silent anymore. The truth was stirring after 6 decades of sleep, and Cole Brennan wasn't going anywhere until he saw it through to the end. Morning came slowly to the ridge, the sun struggling to break through heavy clouds that hung low over the pines like a ceiling, threatening to collapse. Pale light filtered through the cabin windows, turning everything inside to shades of gray and shadow. Cole woke stiff and unrested, his body protesting the night spent on a couch that hadn't been designed for someone his size. Stryker was already awake, sitting by the door with his ears forward, watching the world outside with patient intensity. Cole stirred the embers in the fireplace, coaxing a small flame back to life before grabbing his jacket from the hook. "Come on, Stryker," he said, his voice rough from sleep. "We need supplies. And answers." The dog stretched, shook out his fur in a brief moment of normalcy, then trotted beside Cole as they stepped outside into air so cold it burned going down. The sky hung low and swollen with the promise of more snow. Their breath fogged in the air, rising like pale smoke before dissipating into nothing. The drive into Evergreen Ridge took them along the same winding road they'd traveled the night before, but daylight changed everything. What had seemed mysterious in darkness now looked simply remote. The trees taller, the ravines deeper, the silence heavier, more deliberate. Stryker kept his head out the window, nose working overtime, cataloging every scent carried on the mountain wind. Cole parked near the town's small main square, such as it was. The diner's neon sign buzzed weakly in the cold morning air. A hardware store stood across the street next to a post office, with an American flag snapping in the wind like a whip crack. The few locals out this early paused as Cole stepped onto the sidewalk, their conversations dying mid-sentence. But their gazes didn't linger on Stryker, who trotted obediently at his side with the disciplined bearing of a working dog. They looked at Cole himself, at his face, his build, the quiet intensity in his eyes that came from years of seeing things most people never had to see. Some looked startled, like they were seeing a ghost. Others whispered to their companions, their voices too low to hear, but their meaning clear enough. Cole straightened his shoulders and kept walking. He'd walked into villages overseas where people whispered too, where his presence meant something unwelcome was about to happen. But this felt different, more personal, like he carried his grandmother's sins just by sharing her blood. The diner's bell jingled softly when Cole pushed the door open. Warmth rolled out to meet him. Warmth and the smell of bacon-greased coffee that had been sitting too long, and old wood that had absorbed decades of cooking smoke. A handful of patrons sat scattered across booths and tables, murmuring over breakfast plates and newspapers. The moment Cole stepped inside the room fell into a hush so complete he could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind the counter. He walked to the counter, Stryker settling at his feet with a posture that was crisp and attentive, professional, in a way that made it clear this wasn't a pet but a partner. The waitress approached slowly, a woman who looked to be in her late 60s with silver hair tied back in a loose bun. Her eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and remembered all of it. She offered a polite but guarded smile. "What can I get you, hon?" "Coffee to start," Cole said, "and maybe some information." She paused halfway through, reaching for the pound, her hand hovering in the air. "Information. I'm here about June Brennan. She was my grandmother." The coffee mug she'd been holding hit the counter with a dull thud. 3 men in a booth near the window shifted uneasily, their conversation dying completely. A younger woman at a corner table looked down quickly, pretending she wasn't listening, even though everyone in the room clearly was. The waitress finally poured the coffee, her movements slower now, more careful, like she was buying time to think about what to say. Her eyes softened just a fraction when she looked at him again. "Your grandmother," she set the mug down gently. She kept to herself up there. Folks around here talked more than they should have about things they didn't understand. What did they say? Cole asked, his voice even giving nothing away. Before she could answer, an older woman approached from the end of the counter, moving slowly but with purpose. Her hair was white and braided over one shoulder, her sweater thick and hand-knit, the kind made by someone with too much time and too many memories. "You must be Cole," she said gently, her voice carrying the soft accent of someone who'd lived in these mountains their whole life. "I'm Maggie Sullivan." "I knew June." Cole nodded once. "I was hoping someone here did." Maggie glanced around the diner before lowering her voice, leaning in just enough that her words wouldn't carry to the other tables. "Your grandma wasn't the villain people made her out to be. She was a good woman caught in something she couldn't fight alone." She paused, her eyes searching his face for something, maybe recognition, maybe understanding. "Be careful who you trust in this town." "Why?" Cole asked quietly. "Because not everyone wants the past dug up. Some folks built their lives on what happened to your grandmother. They won't take kindly to questions." Stryker shifted, suddenly ears snapping toward the front windows with laser focus. Cole turned and saw a dark pickup truck parked across the street, the same one from last night. Its engine idled, exhaust curling into the cold air like breath. The windows were tinted so deeply he couldn't see the driver, couldn't tell if anyone was even inside. But it sat there, unmoving, watching. Maggie followed his gaze, her lips pressing into a tight line. "You should finish your coffee and go," she said quietly, urgency creeping into her voice. Cole sipped the bitter heat, slowly, refusing to be rushed, refusing to show fear, even though his pulse had kicked up a notch. Stryker's growl rumbled low and steady, vibrating against Cole's boots, where the dog sat pressed close. The animal had not looked away from the truck. "Maggie," Cole said quietly, his eyes still on the vehicle outside, "what really happened to my grandmother?" Her expression softened with a sorrow that looked like it had been carried for decades. "June was a good woman caught in something she couldn't fight alone." She shook her head slowly. "But whatever she hid in that house of hers, if you found anything, keep it close. Don't trust anyone until you know the whole story." The diner fell silent again. The only sound, the wind rattling the windows and the soft hiss of the coffee maker behind the counter. Cole paid for the coffee and stood, Stryker rising with him in perfect synchronization. As they stepped outside, the cold slapped his face hard enough to clear his thoughts, sharp enough to strip away everything except the immediate reality of the situation. The dark pickup still idled at the curb, engine rumbling, exhaust rising. Cole walked toward his truck with deliberate calm, Stryker glued to his side, every muscle in the dog's body coiled and ready. The driver's window of the pickup lowered just an inch, just enough for Cole to sense eyes behind the glass, watching, evaluating, measuring. Then, without warning, the truck rolled forward slowly, tires crunching over compacted snow, and drove off toward the northern trail without so much as a backward glance. Stryker growled deep in his chest until the vehicle vanished behind a wall of trees in distance. Cole scanned the tree line carefully, his training kicking in automatically. Nothing moved that he could see, but the whole town felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for his next move, watching to see what he would do. He opened his truck door and looked back toward the diner. Maggie stood at the window, her hand pressed against the glass as though she had something more to say but couldn't bring herself to step outside, couldn't risk being seen helping him. Instead, she gave him a small nod. A warning, a plea, maybe both. Cole started the engine and pulled away from Evergreen Ridge, the town shrinking in his rearview mirror, but the feeling of eyes watching, never fading, following them all the way back into the woods. "We're getting close to something, Stryker," he said quietly as the cabin came back into view through the trees. "And they know it." Stryker settled into his seat but kept his gaze locked forward, body tense, ready. The tension hadn't lifted since they'd arrived. If anything, it had grown deeper, sharper, heavier with every hour that passed. Cole exhaled slowly as he parked in the clearing. The mountain was holding its secrets tight, and now he understood that people were willing to do the same, willing to protect lies that had been told so long they'd become truth in the minds of everyone who believed them. But Cole Brennan hadn't come here to believe. He'd come here to find out what his grandmother had died protecting, and he wasn't leaving until he did. By the time Cole and Stryker reached the cabin, the last traces of daylight had vanished behind the ridge, swallowed by peaks that cut the sky into jagged pieces. A thin layer of fresh snow covered the clearing, glowing faintly under the pale moon that filtered through breaks in the clouds. Cole's flashlight beam swept across the trees as he stepped out of the truck, his breath fogging in the cold mountain air that had dropped another 10 degrees since they'd left town. Stryker jumped down beside him, body going rigid, immediately ears pricked forward with the kind of focus that meant something was wrong. The dog had already picked up on it. An unfamiliar scent. A disturbance. Something out of place. Cole followed Stryker's gaze toward the cabin door. It was open. Just slightly, but definitely open. Cole froze, his pulse tightening in his chest like a fist closing around his heart. He knew he had locked it. The memory was clear, deliberate. He turned the key, checked the handle, made sure everything was secure before they'd left for town. A faint memory rose unbidden from years of training, the first rule drilled into every soldier on patrol. If something is off, assume danger until proven otherwise. Stay close, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind moving through the pines. Stryker moved low and silent, the same way he used to during night operations when stealth meant survival. His body language shifted into something predatory, controlled, professional. Cole approached from the side, avoiding the direct line of the doorway where anyone waiting inside would have a clear shot. His flashlight stayed low and angled, sweeping the ground for footprints for signs of entry. The snow near the entryway was disturbed. Two sets of prints, one fresh and deep, the other already beginning to fade under the falling snow that had started again. Someone had been here, not long ago. Maybe they were still inside. Cole steadied his breathing, focusing on the present, on the immediate threat, pushing back the pressure, building behind his ribs. The early warning signs of a flashback tried to creep in at the edges of his awareness. The familiar tightness, the sound of his own heartbeat too loud in his ears. He closed his eyes for half a second, grounding himself the way he'd practiced in therapy sessions he'd never wanted to attend, but had needed desperately. Count. Breathe. Focus on what's real. Stryker nudged the back of his knee with deliberate pressure, snapping him back to the present with the kind of tactile reminder that words couldn't provide. They slipped inside together, moving through the doorway with practiced coordination. The air in the cabin felt colder than it should, as if the warmth had been sucked out by whoever had forced their way in, as if their presence had left something hollow behind. The fire from this morning was dead, nothing but ash now. But the ashes had been disturbed, scattered across the stone hearth in patterns that spoke of careless movement, of someone searching quickly. Stryker moved ahead with his nose close to the floor, following an invisible trail only he could detect. Cole swept the flashlight across the room, his jaw tightening with each new detail that emerged from the shadows. Chaos. Papers scattered across the floor like leaves after a storm. Drawers pulled open, their contents spilled onto the table and chairs. The lockbox he'd found last night sat overturned near the fireplace, its lid hanging open at an awkward angle. He crouched beside it, checking the contents with quick, efficient movements. Nothing inside appeared stolen. The photographs were still there, though they'd been shuffled through. The newspaper clippings remained, their edges bent from hasty handling. The bundles of old bills sat untouched at the bottom. Whoever broke in wasn't after money. They were searching for something specific. Something they thought June Brennan had hidden. Something they believed was dangerous enough to risk breaking into a dead woman's home. Stryker moved toward the table, his posture tightening with each step, body language shifting into full alert. He stopped beside a piece of paper left in the center of the table, placed there deliberately meant to be found. Cole picked it up slowly, his hands steady despite the anger beginning to simmer beneath his carefully maintained calm. The handwriting was jagged and rushed, written with a heavy hand that had pressed hard enough to leave indentations in the wood beneath. Stop digging. Leave now. Last warning. B. His chest tightened, but not with fear. With something sharper, colder. The kind of anger that came from being threatened, from being told to walk away from something that mattered. The old life flickered through his memory. The missions. The threats from enemies who thought intimidation would work. The games people played when they had power and wanted to keep it. He didn't try to suppress it this time. He let the anger settle into something useful, something focused. Stryker let out a low growl deep in his throat, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. Cole stood again, scanning the room with fresh eyes, replaying every detail in his mind. Whoever broke in had known exactly where to look. They'd gone straight for the hidden panel behind the dresser, had known about the lockbox, had searched through its contents with the kind of familiarity that came from prior knowledge. Someone with stakes in what June Brennan had hidden. Someone who believed they could frighten him off with a note and a show of power. They didn't know him well enough. He moved through the cabin, methodically checking corners, entry points, looking for how they'd gotten in. The back window had been pried open with something thin but strong. A flat tool, maybe a pry bar. The wood frame bore fresh scratches bright against the weathered grain. Snow beneath the window had been disturbed footprints leading back toward the woods in a line that disappeared into darkness and distance. Stryker followed the prints to the tree line, barking once. Sharp. Angry. A sound Cole had heard before when the pose sensed a threat he couldn't reach, couldn't neutralize. Cole placed a hand on Stryker's back, feeling the tension coiled in every muscle. Easy. They're gone. But his own pulse was still elevated, his breathing still shallow. He forced himself to inhale slowly, drawing air until the tremor behind his ribs quieted enough to think clearly. The last thing he needed was a flashback hitting him now, blind and disoriented, in a place where someone had just proven they were willing to cross lines. He walked back inside and stared at the note again. B. Benjamin Caldwell, or someone working for him. Someone who thought a threat scrawled on paper would be enough to make a former Navy SEAL turn and run. Cole folded the note carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket beside the journal pages he'd been carrying since last night. Stryker suddenly lifted his head, ears locked toward the woods beyond the clearing. A faint sound drifted through the trees, far off but unmistakable. The rumble of an engine starting, a vehicle pulling away. Someone had waited, watched long enough to make sure Cole saw the message, saw the violation, understood the threat. "You hear that?" Cole whispered. Stryker growled quietly, then looked back at Cole, as if asking what came next, what the plan was, whether they were staying or leaving. Cole moved toward the window, peering out at the dark stretch of forest where snow continued to fall in lazy spirals. Snowflakes caught the moonlight, turning everything beyond a few yards into an indistinct blur of white and shadow. Whoever had been here knew the terrain intimately, knew how to move through these woods without leaving traces that mattered, knew how to disappear into the landscape like they'd been born to it. He stepped back from the window, rubbing his thumb across the edge of the note in his pocket. "This wasn't random," he said softly, his voice steady now, focused. "They wanted us to know they were here." Stryker exhaled sharply through his nose, restless, waiting for direction. Cole began gathering the scattered papers, but his hands paused when he lifted one of June's clipped newspaper articles that had been knocked to the floor. It was folded open to the same headline from the lockbox. "Relief funds missing. Local woman vanishes." He stared at it for a long moment, seeing not just the words, but the weight behind them. The years of accusation his grandmother had carried, the burden she'd borne alone, because speaking the truth would have cost her everything. Whatever she'd found back then, someone was still protecting it, still willing to threaten, still afraid after 60 years. He collected the remaining documents and placed them back in the lockbox, snapping the lid shut with more force than necessary. This time he didn't return it to the hidden panel. Instead, he carried it to a loose floorboard near his sleeping bag, one he'd noticed this morning when the light had been better, one that looked deliberate rather than accidental. He pried up the board carefully and tucked the lockbox into the space beneath, then replaced the plank and covered it with his gear. Not its original hiding spot, but somewhere June's intruder wouldn't expect. Somewhere that bought him time if they came back. Stryker circled twice before lying down beside the fireplace, though he didn't relax. His eyes remained fixed on the front door, watching, waiting, ready for whatever came next. Cole sat on the edge of the couch, rubbing the back of his neck, where tension had gathered like a knot tied too tight. His breath still felt shallow, but he managed to steady it again through sheer force of will, through the techniques that had kept him functional when his mind wanted to spiral back to sand and heat and faces he couldn't save. He wasn't leaving. Not after this. Not after someone had violated his grandmother's home, had threatened him, had proven they were still willing to protect lives that should have died decades ago. Not after June had carried this burden alone for so long. He glanced at Stryker, who watched him with amber eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should. "We dig deeper now," Cole murmured into the quiet. "They should have left us alone." Outside, the wind picked up, rushing across the cabin roof like a warning, whispered in a language only the mountain understood. Cole lay down on the couch, but his eyes stayed open long after the fire faded to embers, listening for any shift in the night, any sound that didn't belong. Stryker didn't sleep at all. Neither did Cole. By the time dawn crept over the ridge again, pale and hesitant, the cabin felt colder than the mountain itself. Morning light pushed through the frosted windows in weak shafts that did nothing to warm the air inside. Cole sat beside the fireplace, feeding it small pieces of split wood, watching flames catch slowly and spread with reluctant heat. Stryker lay near the door, still maintaining his vigil, eyes fixed on the thin gap beneath the frame, as if expecting the intruders to return at any moment. Cole rubbed his hands together, feeling the stiffness in his fingers from a night without real rest, from hours spent listening to every creak and groan of the old cabin settling around him. The break-in hadn't just shaken him, it had awakened something he'd been trying to keep buried, something protective, something that understood threats and knew how to respond to them. Someone had violated his grandmother's home, had searched through her things, had left a threat on her table like they owned the place, like they had the right. The old instincts sharpened again, the ones that had once kept him alive, in places where hesitation meant death. "Come on," he said quietly to the striker. "We've got work to do." The dog rose immediately, giving a small shake that sent cold air swirling through the room. Cole retrieved the lockbox from its temporary hiding place beneath the floorboards and set it on the kitchen table where the morning light was strongest. The firelight flickered across its rusted metal surface, highlighting every scratch, every dent, every mark left by time and deliberate concealment. He opened the lid carefully, treating the contents with the kind of respect they deserved after being hidden for 6 decades. Inside, everything rested exactly where he'd placed it last night. The photographs, the yellowed newspaper clippings, the bundle of handwritten notes tied with twine that had gone brittle with age. He untied the twine, slowly feeling it crumble slightly under his fingers. The first page was a journal entry written in June's strong, firm handwriting. The ink faded but still legible, still carrying the weight of words that had mattered enough to preserve. October 30th, 1964. "They're blaming me. I knew they would. Benjamin Caldwell came to the house yesterday. He said the missing funds were my responsibility. He said if I spoke a word of the truth, I'd lose everything. But I cannot stay silent. I will hide what I know. One day someone will need it." Cole read the words twice, letting them settle, letting the implications sink in deeper than they had the first time. His grandmother hadn't just been caught in some misunderstanding or bureaucratic mistake. She had been targeted deliberately, pressured, threatened into silence by someone with power and the willingness to use it. And she had chosen to protect evidence rather than protect herself. The tension in his shoulders deepened, spreading down his spine like ice water. Stryker stepped closer, resting his chin on Cole's thigh with deliberate pressure. The dog's steady warmth cut through the cold rage building in Cole's chest, grounding him before he could spiral too far into anger that wouldn't help anyone. Another entry dated 2 weeks later filled half a page with cramped handwriting that looked like it had been written quickly, urgently. November 12, 1964. "Benjamin Caldwell offered me money. He said if I disappeared quietly, the town would forget. I refused. He called me foolish. But I know what they did. I know whose hands stole from the victims. If the truth dies with me, then the town dies with it." A cold knot formed in Cole's stomach, tightening with each word. The picture was becoming clearer now, sharper, more focused. His grandmother had discovered something. Something big enough that powerful people were willing to pay her off, threaten her, drive her into exile rather than let it come to light. He sifted through the remaining pages with careful fingers. Some were journal entries documenting meetings, conversations, veiled threats delivered with smiles and handshakes. Others were letters June had written, but never sent, words meant for people who would never read them. One envelope caught his attention. It was addressed to someone named Thomas Brennan, in handwriting he recognized as his grandmother's, but the name made his breath catch. His father. The envelope had never been opened, never delivered, kept all these years for reasons Cole couldn't begin to guess. His hands trembled just slightly when he held it, feeling the weight of words that might explain everything or nothing, conversations that should have happened but didn't, truths that came too late to change anything. He didn't open it. Not yet. Not until he understood the full story, not until he knew what his grandmother had been trying to say. Stryker let out a quiet huff, turning toward the window with sudden interest. His body stiffened in that way that meant someone was coming, something was approaching. Cole followed the dog's gaze, but the falling snow outside obscured everything beyond the clearing. Nothing moved that he could see. Just white on white, endless and silent. "It's okay," Cole said, though he kept his hand near Stryker's collar just in case. He returned to the lockbox and lifted the stack of old photographs, black and white images that had yellowed at the edges but still captured moments frozen in time. Flooded streets after the mudslide. Destroyed homes reduced to rubble and mud. Volunteers working with shovels and determination, their faces marked by exhaustion and something deeper, something that looked like grief turned into purpose. And there, standing near what appeared to be a relief station set up in the town square, 3 figures. June Brennan, younger but unmistakable, her posture straight and strong, her eyes bright and even captured in grayscale. Beside her stood a man Cole didn't recognize, wearing a suit too clean for the destruction surrounding them. Benjamin Caldwell. It had to be. The way he stood spoke of authority, of someone used to being in charge, used to being obeyed without question. His foot angled slightly away from the camera, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Someone hiding discomfort. Someone who didn't want to be photographed but couldn't afford not to be. Cole set the photos aside, his mind working through connections, building a framework from fragments. This wasn't just about money, he said under his breath. This was about power, about who controlled the story. He leaned back in the chair, rubbing the back of his neck, where tension had settled like a permanent weight. A familiar heaviness crept through his chest, tightening the air around him. The same sensation that sometimes flickered through when old memories pressed too close, when the past became more real than the present. The sound of explosions in the distance. The sight of a teammate going down. The feeling of being responsible for lives that depended on split-second decisions. Decisions that couldn't be undone when they went wrong. Stryker nudged him again, harder this time, more insistent. Cole took a deep breath, held it, released it slowly through clenched teeth. Count to 4. Hold. Release. Thanks, partner, he whispered, his voice rough around the edges. He turned back to the table and opened the final letter in the stack, recognizing the shakier handwriting that spoke of years passing, of hands growing weaker, but will remaining strong. If you are reading this, it means the truth survived longer than I expected. I pray you are stronger than I was. I pray you are not afraid. They wanted the money. They took it from the people who needed it most. And when I tried to stop them, they made sure I was alone. Cole swallowed hard against the lump forming in his throat. June hadn't left to save herself. She had left to save the evidence, to protect the truth, even when it cost her everything she had, even when it meant spending the rest of her life branded as a criminal by people who should have known better. He stood slowly and walked to the window, looking out at the forest that stretched endlessly toward peaks he couldn't see through the snow. Somewhere out there, someone had broken into this cabin last night. Someone who still feared what June Brennan had left behind, who understood that secrets buried for 60 years might still have power. We can't run from this, Cole said quietly, the words meant for himself as much as for Stryker. The dog pressed against his leg in silent agreement, solid and unwavering. Cole turned back to the table, his decision already made before he'd fully articulated it. He grabbed his coat and tucked the journal pages into the inner pocket, folding them carefully so they wouldn't crease or tear. He scanned the room once more, taking in the weight of history contained within these walls, the burden his grandmother had carried alone for longer than most people lived. What you didn't do for yourself, he said softly, thinking of June, imagining her sitting at this same table, writing these same words, knowing she might never be believed. And now we finish what you started. Stryker barked once, low, steady, a sound of acknowledgement and readiness that needed no translation. The mountain wasn't silent anymore. The truth was stirring after 6 decades of enforced sleep, and Cole Brennan had no intention of letting it be buried again. Not when his grandmother had sacrificed everything to keep it alive. Not when people were still willing to threaten and intimidate to keep it hidden. He looked down at Stryker, who watched him with eyes that had seen combat and understood duty in ways most humans never would. We're not leaving, Cole said firmly. Not until this is done. The dog's tail moved once. Agreement. Commitment. Outside, the wind picked up again, rushing through the pines with a sound like distant voices, like the mountain itself was finally ready to speak after years of forced silence. Cole Brennan wasn't running anymore. He was done running. This time he was staying. And he was going to make sure the truth his grandmother had protected finally saw the light of day, no matter who tried to stop him. The morning stretched on, and Cole spent it methodically going through every document in the lockbox, committing names and dates to memory, building a timeline of events that had been deliberately obscured for 6 decades. By the time he finished, he understood exactly what June Brennan had discovered and exactly why Benjamin Caldwell had been willing to destroy her life to keep it hidden. And now Cole Brennan was going to make sure everyone else understood it too.